Well, hello, history and geography class, 5th and 6th graders. Listen, I miss y'all. I really do. And I like to try to think when I'm going through these lectures what you would be doing in class. I know a lot of you would be like, can I read? Can I read? But I miss that so much, and hope you're doing well. We are going to finish the chapter today, and that means tomorrow we are going to have an open book test, so don't sweat it. We're going to have an open book test. I may do like we did before and give y'all a couple of days to do it, or I may make up a separate test, a different one than doing it out of the book. So don't start working on the book one yet, because I've got several tests I can use. But it will be open book, so you can have all the answers. Beware of Google. I may have shared this with y'all, but I had one class that there was a question: who was Andrew Johnson's Secretary of, I can't remember what it was now. And anyway, people were Googling it, and it was pulling up Lyndon Johnson's secretary. So be careful when you're Googling. All of these answers will be in your book, so keep that in mind. Want to go through this last section. We'll kind of pick up where we left off. This is section 14.6. It's 263 in your book, so turn there real quick. Come on, get it, come on. You got this, 263. 263, everybody there? All right, a couple of things I want us to talk about this morning, or today. One thing, we spent a whole hour talking about one day. We talked about it on September 11th of last year, 2019. September the 11th was a major day. You'll read some of the stuff that happened, but of course the World Trade Center was attacked. You had a plane flown into each tower. Both of those buildings collapsed. You remember us talking about that. The Pentagon had an airplane flown into it. And a fourth plane that was meant to strike Washington, D.C., actually the passengers stood up against the terrorists, and the plane ended up crashing in a Pennsylvania field. They killed everyone on the plane. It was a horrible thing, but they did manage to hopefully save some lives in Washington, D.C. About 2,800 people were dead in the Twin Towers, about 184 in the Pentagon, and then 40 people on the airplane in Pennsylvania. Terrible, terrible day in American history, and as I told y'all, when we talked about this on September 11th, I remember what I was doing, almost what I was wearing that day. I remember watching the news coverage, and it still sends a chill down my spine every time I talk about it, and every time I watch a video or watch news coverage from that day. Major, major event in American history. As a result, this is page 264. That's where we're going to roll through some material. The hijackings were the work of an Islamic group called Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda had a leader by the name of Osama bin Laden. Now, as I mentioned, under Clinton, President Clinton, Bill Clinton, I had a chance to get Osama bin Laden, but I didn't. He did. He had a chance to take him out, and he didn't. So as a result, I think almost a direct result, America had September 11th. If Bill Clinton had done his job, perhaps that would have never happened. But anyway, Osama bin Laden was the mastermind behind this, or at least one of them. And so we start a war on terror. Now, the problem with the war on terror, it's not all Muslims, it's not all Islamic peoples, it's not all people of a certain skin color. There are a certain group of those people that are terrorists, and they want to do harm to America. They want to do harm to Israel. They want to do harm to what they term infidels. And it basically depends on how radical you are within the Muslim faith as to whether you are one of these radical terrorists. And so we had to deal with that. The problem is terrorists don't wear uniforms. So if you're fighting in a country, we go to Afghanistan, and your book mentions that. Afghanistan, one of the first targets was the Taliban, or the Taliban. I like to say Taliban. Later president would say Taliban. But anyway, radical Islamic group that had taken power in Afghanistan, and they were sheltering, they were hiding the Al-Qaeda terrorists. So we go to war there. The problem is a terrorist isn't going to wear a uniform that says, hey, I'm a terrorist. They're going to try to blend in with the people. It makes it tough to be a warrior or a fighter fighting terrorists. But we fought this war. We had a lot of stuff going on there. And then we also confronted an old enemy. The old enemy was Saddam Hussein. And you'll remember he's the one that took over Kuwait. He was the leader of Iraq. And so we got word that supposedly, and I still believe to this day he did. A lot of people will say he didn't. I believe he hid them, he moved them, he did something with them. But we had received word and intelligence that Saddam Hussein had been massing weapons of mass destruction. He had been getting a hold of weapons of mass destruction. In other words, nuclear bombs, chemical bombs, those type of things, where he could do mass damage to people and cause mass casualties, devastation, and death. So 2003, the White House was convinced of it. We went before the UN. We did several things, and we launched Operation Iraqi Freedom. And basically, it was to remove Saddam Hussein. Now, Saddam Hussein will end up being hung. The people were free. There was a lot of violence. There was a lot of struggle in Iraq. But your book says this, and I love it. In spite of the violence, the first free election in 50 years was held in Iraq in January of 2005. So just less than 2 years after we went into Iraq, removed Saddam Hussein, they had free elections. Now, are they where they need to be today? No, they're not. But it's a lot better than it was under the crazy dictator Saddam Hussein. 2004 comes up. Remember, George W. Bush was elected in 2000. It was a close election with Al Gore. He's going to run this time against John Kerry. He was a senator from Massachusetts, where they parked the car in the garage instead of park the car in the garage. And John Kerry and George Bush were two separate individuals. John Kerry's still around. He's still, he does things that just make me mad. Let's put it this way. John Kerry is for abortion. John Kerry is for big government. John Kerry is for higher taxes. John Kerry is for America giving in to other countries and giving them what they want. George Bush was not for that. He was against abortion. He was against raising taxes. He was for a smaller government and smaller government spending. The election was close, but President Bush won re-election. He won the majority of the Electoral College votes. One thing that President Bush did, your book mentions this, he had the opportunity, much like President Trump has had two occasions to do this, he had an opportunity to appoint two conservatives to the Supreme Court. Now, were they as conservative as I would have liked? No. But they were more conservative than what was on there. They were John G. Roberts and Samuel Alito. And they are on the Supreme Court, I believe, to this day. So that was to, anytime a president can put someone on the Supreme Court, that is huge. And that's why elections, part of why elections are so important and why you want someone conservative that backs your values, that is anti-abortion, that is for prayer, for God, for guns, those type of things. Because if a liberal president is in there, who are they going to appoint? They're going to appoint someone who is for abortion, who is for taking prayer out of school, for infringing on people's rights. So that's part of why elections are so important. That was why it was so important for George W. Bush to be reelected. We also see here on page 265, natural disasters. You'll see a picture, and it's not a great picture, of some of the flooding of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. There were several. For the first time in one season, you had four major killer hurricanes: Charlie, Francis, Ivan, and Jean. And they killed more than 100 people. These four hurricanes did cause more than $25 billion damage in Florida alone. And then comes Hurricane Katrina in August of 2005, about a year later. Now, Katrina was a massive storm. We knew it was going to hit the coast. We didn't know if it was going to be in New Orleans or Louisiana. We didn't know if it was going to be in Mississippi. We didn't know if it was going to be in Alabama at first. But we knew it was a massive storm. And I remember when it came on shore, everything in New Orleans looked good. New Orleans is built underwater. Okay, they pumped water out. They built a series of levees around it, and it is below sea level. If you go to New Orleans, you are standing, and some of you I'm sure have been, I've been 3 or 4 times, it is under the sea level, below sea level. So if water breaches or goes over those levees, it's going to flood. And what happened in Katrina, it did a lot of damage to Mississippi, Gulfport, Mississippi, Mobile, Alabama. It damaged it. They saw great destruction. But New Orleans was devastated. A lot of people did not evacuate New Orleans. They should have, but they didn't. And their mayor was not smart at all. They had ways they could have evacuated people, and they didn't. And so anyway, there were about 1,300 people in Katrina that died. It did about $100 billion in damage. Katrina became the costliest storm ever in United States history at that point, and I believe that may still stand. But what happened in New Orleans, it blew through, and everybody thought, hey, we're okay. But one of the levees had broken, and it started to flood New Orleans, and people were trapped, and it was a devastating time. Another sad thing that took place, and I won't make you watch a video about this, but I woke up on a Sunday morning. We were getting ready to go to church. My wife and I had just gotten married. We were living in an apartment together. We were about to move out of that apartment into another place. And I woke up, and as my habit is, a lot of times in the morning, I'll wake up and I'll turn on the TV to news to see what's happening. And on the news, they were awaiting the landing of the Space Shuttle Columbia. They were waiting for it to come in. And somewhere over Texas, they lost contact with it. And what happened is basically during the liftoff, one of those pieces of styrofoam that cover the solid rocket boosters, it fell off during launch several days before and hit one of the wings. Well, on the edges, the leading edges of these wings, they have these tiles that protect them from re-entry, because when you come back into the atmosphere, it gets extremely hot. It had knocked off some of these tiles, and when Space Shuttle Columbia comes back in for a landing, the heat burns up the space shuttle and burned it into a lot of pieces. It was a terrible, devastating thing. Killed all of the astronauts on board. So it was another dark day in American history. Your book talks about illegal immigration. You're well aware of those issues, and we've talked about that in class before. It also talks about Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, an axis of evil. North Korea to this day, I don't know if you've seen the news today, but Kim Jong-un, the leader of Korea, he may be, according to some news reports, in extremely bad health. He may have had a heart procedure. He may be on the verge of death, who knows, but North Korea is one of those spots we always have to watch. We also had concerns, by the way, they're a communist nation. He's a dictator, terrible person, and you have to watch them, and we've had struggles with them for years. Also, your book talks about a nuclear Iran. There was a threat that Iran, and there is to this day, that they could get a hold of nuclear weapons. We have to watch against that. They're one of the main sponsors of Islamic terrorism in the Middle East, so we have to keep an eye on them. And it talks about the election of 2008. The Republicans put up a weak candidate. He was a war hero, I'll give him that, but he was a weak candidate. He was old, not a very exciting candidate. And his name was John McCain. He was a U.S. Senator, a former prisoner of war. And they put him up against a young African-American by the name of Barack Obama, who was charismatic, who excited people, who, much like Trump, would draw large crowds at his rallies, that type of thing. And you can imagine how that election worked out. You know how that election worked out. Barack Obama received 53% of the vote compared to John McCain's 46%. And Obama became the 44th president and the first black president in our nation's history. That's pretty much the end of the chapter. I want you to make sure you've read over this, make sure you're familiar with it, look back over your chapter and look for the highlighted terms, because chances are if it's on the test, it's going to be one of these highlighted terms. Tomorrow, you will have an open book test, so be ready for it. You'll do well. If you have any questions, got the hiccups. If you have any questions, message me on Classroom, and I'll be glad to answer anything I can and help you in any way. You'll have instructions with the test for time limits. May just be due in one day. If it's a longer test, it may be two. I want to give you the best opportunity you can have to make a good grade. Listen, y'all, take care. Have a great day.